You're the new person in a sort of prehistoric landscape. And you can be the first in practically any of the arts in Australia now.
Russell Drysdale, the landscape painter, had been an important influence on Donald. They met in the war years and shared an artist's feeling for country Australia.
He had a new car, so he ran it in, looking for some bush ghost town, and find a cottage for me to live in. And so went to Hill End, up behind Bathurst, New South Wales. And we actually found a cottage, which I bought, about 37 quid. And I suppose in about 1947, perhaps.
The sleepy town soon became alive with fresh pub gossip, while adjusting to the new citizens and their city visitors. Reporters were dispatched from Sydney. Donald was photographed doing the Saturday morning shopping with Russell Drysdale's young son, Tim. But of course, there was painting going on. Drysdale completed a portrait of Donald at Hill End in 1948.
He never really worked directly from you. He made a number of little pencil drawings of me and other ones of the church at Hill End. And months later, began working on the oil.
Drysdale's daughter, Lynn, called on Donald Murray, who had paid for half share of the cottage. Lynn first visited Hill End as a schoolgirl.
I would have been about 10.
Yes.
9 or 10, or earlier perhaps.
And we had no water supply and no electricity and nothing in the whole thing.
I can't remember the garden not being here. No.
It was bare.
There was a well.
There was nothing in the front of the place, you know.
In the Australian manner, Russell Drysdale attracted a nickname. He was called Taz by family and friends.
Taz did a lot of work in this area.
Oh, well, I mean, some of the major paintings. The Cricketers, of course.
The Cricketers, 1948, depicts the Hill End pub and the general store. Donald Murray stayed on in Hill End until his death in 1988, when the classified cottage, like the entire town, became part of the nation's heritage. It's remembered as the cottage Donald Friend and Russell Drysdale found.
Taz was very much a country man, really, in his heart, as it were, though he hadn't lived much in the country, you know, since he was young. But he liked that sort of country where you look for miles and miles and a few sort of dead gum trees and so on, and great spaces, and sort of, you know, terrific simplicity of great skies and so on. But he didn't like it cluttered up with leaves. And a bit of a nuisance for him, because round Hill End was absolutely stuffed full of, you know, avenues of flourishing trees and lots of eucalyptus forests around there. And but then, of course, a painter takes any subject, and what he's really painting is himself and his own preferences in life. So, you know, I would say he could have gone to the South Pole and still made it look like Central Australia or something. I tried to make these little, tiny little sort of shorthand notes, as it were, and painted some of his finest pictures from them, including a portrait of myself, which is in the Sydney National Gallery. And I like to look at it and think, oh, well, you know, those are good times.
In post-war Sydney, these brilliant young things all lived in a large Victorian house, Mariula.
We had mad parties. And at that time, I used to dance a great deal. I liked boogie-woogie. And we'd have boogie playing like mad in my place. In a way, I suppose you could compare it to a very big boarding house that happens to be full of artists.
Meriula revisited, albeit vicariously, through an exhibition at the S.H. Irvine Gallery in Sydney in 1986. During the setting up, Donald happened upon Sydney journalist Christopher Leonard.
Jack Lang's
Bishop and Jack Lang and his bull.
Yeah.
In that picture, which I painted Meriula, the business in the sky there of people like Blamey and Jack Lang and Colonel de Groot or Major de Groot or whatever he was, that was all sort of things that had happened long before Meriula. It happened in the 30s. And at the opening of the bridge with de Groot and Lang being premier at the period. But they were sort of, in a way, like legends of one's early adolescence, you know, because I'd been a kid, I suppose, about 14 or 15 at the time that de Groot so dramatically opened the bridge. And we thought it was very, very funny.
The apotheosis of Ned Kelly shows the outlaw arriving in heaven with the noose still around his neck. It was painted in 1946, about the same time as Sidney Nolan was beginning his famous series in Melbourne. But it must be said that when Donald began the preliminary sketches for the oil, he saw it all as a bit of a giggle, a rogues gallery, with a dove of peace carrying an atom bomb in its claws.
You see, those ones were really not people I knew personally. They were more sort of almost symbolic people. Kelly being particularly symbolic, because it's so odd to take a horse thief and a murderer as a national hero. Just sort of an idea of what life was like at the time, is what I saw as being paintable.
Sydney doesn't have these big bucks and wenches anymore, does it?
No, their sort of tits are out. It's curious the way anatomy really sort of moves up and down and sideways even, you know. I saw in Italy, in a great cemetery somewhere or other in Tuscany, a mural on a wall that had been bashed up a lot in the war, but there was enough surviving of it, of youth and death and the maiden sort of thing. It was a subject that came from the great plagues of the medieval times when everybody sort of was dying like flies. And this had the effect that those who survived decided just to have a completely mad, wonderful, wild time. And there was absolute sort of moral suspension. And I took it for various incidents in my own life.
The exhibition, Meriula and After, also displayed later works. Fountain of Youth was done in 1951.
There's vaguely Byzantine influence behind all of that, you know, the way they have things running along as like a chronicle.
Actually, there are a few of your paintings that have got that Byzantine influence in it, especially
a great influence.
The gold leaf.
Yes.
Where did you come across this in Sydney?
In Byzantium.
In Byzantium itself.
Constantinople, yes.
22nd of August, 1966. I worked very well today on a self-portrait in a battered top hat which I'd begun about a week ago. Worked on desultorily until it got so overworked that it had lost all its spark. Then, suddenly, a few angry dabs, and it began to come alive. I'm very pleased indeed.
We got out of the army, etc., and went into Meriula. Some of the people who were at Meriula had been there during the war, you know, like Justin O'Brien, who'd got back to Australia. He'd been a prisoner of war in Greece. And
I got out of the army, and Loudon St Hill and Harry Tatlock Miller suggested me taking a room there. And then I think Donald must have just got out of the army sometime a little bit later, and he came to live in the room under me. He did come up one day to me and suggested we should exchange drawings, which we did. He had a model who used to come there regularly, and he was a nice-looking, fair boy. It was Colin, I think, and Donald did many, many drawings of him. He used to draw him all day, practically. Harry and Loudon gave great big parties up in their room, and of course the Sydney Society were there, and Donald had a very big room opening onto the main entrance down below. He had his own parties downstairs, and they were very raughty and noisy, and there was an enormous amount of laughter from them. And I used to lie in bed going to sleep, and I couldn't go to sleep for laughing myself because of the real fun going on down below.
My place, actually, my studio there, was a bit wild, you know. It was full of, I don't know, drunken sailors. When we got in a few barrels of beer, etc., and gave a huge party, say 200-300 people, in the ballroom there, vast ballroom, and then you'd have all of these people like Claudio Rao and various others coming. We'd usually have some very good dancer, an Indian dancer, say, to dance, and good music, lots of wine and beer, and just enjoyment.
Photographer Alec Murray recorded the years. The major domo of Mariula was the ebullient Melbourne sculptress Chica Lowe, who sublet rooms to fellow artists, as Justin O'Brien recalls.
Chica wanted painters and writers and musicians, those people. No one got in anyone else's way when it came to work. And we did work. We worked, the fun was for after work. And there was a lot of fun, but I mean it was, and we never got it in the way, and they were all very helpful to one another. Actually, they were about the happiest 2 years of my life, I think, that I had.
A lot of us went off, like Eric Murray and Loudon St Hill, and some went to America, and some went to Europe.
Harry Tatlock Miller, the art critic, became director of the Redfern Galleries, London, where he was the first to exhibit Nolan, Friend, and Loudon St Hill. Loudon travelled to London to work as a theatre designer for the Royal Ballet, Shakespeare companies, and in the West End, including Noel Coward's musical Sail Away. Jocelyn Rickards enjoyed success in London as a film designer, working on Ryan's Daughter and Sunday Bloody Sunday with Peter Finch. Mariula was demolished in 1951. Bonfire at King's Cross, a painting to celebrate the German surrender on the 9th of May, 1945.
I was only a war artist for the last year or so of the war. Before that, my career had been at first in artillery. And artillery and I just detested one another outright, you know. I behaved badly after a while, properly badly, and so I was sent off to a Labour battalion. That was much more like soldiering, you know. We were working as wharfies, really. Hard work and so on, and then you had leave, and you went to parties. And yeah, it was quite all right. This all happened in Queensland. And then I met a chap at several of these parties, and he asked me what I did. He knew my paintings, actually. So I told him that I was working on the walls, and he said, "Oh, that's terrible, you know. Great artist like you." And took my particulars. And next thing, I was in a special intelligence unit, of which he was commanding officer. That was quite terrific. I really enjoyed that. And Brisbane at that time was absolutely mad. And Sven had quite a marvellous time. And then suddenly whizzed out of that into the war art business. Bits of New Guinea and Borneo, Labuan. I wasn't ever one of those war artists who went on for that sort of follow me chaps, you know, to the barricades. My work was much more like what really happened, you know. A lot of it was very nasty and boring.
Perhaps the most fortunate incident in Donald's war had been meeting Russell Drysdale, who owned a property near an army camp. It was 1942. Just a few years earlier, news of the outbreak of war caused the young prodigal to return from Africa.
And you lived right in Ghana, in Accra, or up in the country?
Near the,
Yeah.
it's called this little, I was born in a little village called Timpopo, near Kosovo.
Well, I was in love with Africa and all of the Africans, actually. Of course, that's a long time ago. It's about 1913, something or other, I've forgotten now. And in Nigeria, Yoruba people mostly, some of the Igbos. And the Yoruba towns, up country, small kingdoms. And I lived there for about 2.5 years, I suppose. But it was a wonderful time. Any time would have been marvelous, simply being young. But, you know, there I lived in this sort of great mud palace, you know, and I had my own courtyard and house there, and with sort of veranda pillars carved with absolutely fabulous figures and painted in sort of clay paints. And the whole town was full of West African artifacts, you know. Wonderful stuff, so beautiful, and with such a tremendously strong, oh God, I've forgotten the word, not influence, but sort of meaning for European art of that period. And of course, I'd been living in Europe, and it was all, you see, it was all happening in Europe and it was happening in Africa. It wasn't something that is already history as it is now. It was there and then.
Living in the inland province of Ikerre during 1939, Donald sculpts with the native Casters Guild, using the ancient lost wax technique. These are Donald's works.
A marvelous African woman called Igeya Gumbi got me a servant, and I asked him to tell me about a good country kingdom where there weren't any whites, and so we went up to where he'd been born, and that was this place, Ikerre. And so about 2 weeks later, I was advisor to the King of Ikerre, the Ogogre of Ikerre. And so there I was, living in this great mud palace, on nothing but sort of grandeur, you know. And of course, at that age, one could advise anybody of anything. I could advise the King of England, with great advantage to him, and perhaps some to myself.
Donald sailed to Lagos, Nigeria, in the crook of Western Africa on the 20th of September, 1939.
I had no money, and so I wrote to my father's solicitor. I was sort of black sheep, you know, and said that I was working as a lift boy. And I knew that would shock him, because in those days, you know, people had great respect for families and things. And I wanted to go there on a French ship from Marseille, not from England, and I'd need some money. And so he booked the passage for me, and I had £100 that he gave me as part of this thing. Then I had about 30 quid of my own, and so I went down to Marseille to wait for the ship to sail. And of course, living in a little hotel and all of that, you know, money began running out. And so I went to the French shipping line and said I want to change to 3rd class or 4th class. And you know, the French, very suspicious. They thought I was trying to diddle some firm that was employing me or something like that, you know, to get a bit of change. However, I got my way in the end, and off I went down there. You can't lose if you're young. I was quite attractive in those days too. Amusing, you know.
In a Christmas letter to his mother in 1936, he wrote, My figure is much the same. My hair is long and my eyes are wild like a poet's. My mouth still expresses the insatiably erotic desire for insatiability, and my brows have lost none of their fine curve.
In London, I studied under Ikerre and Bennetts who were considerable painters, and for sort of a design and all that. Mervyn Peake, you know, is better known as a writer, fabulous bloke. And those teachers were very important to me. And their works are more or less forgotten now. They'll be rediscovered as though they've been living like gnomes under a toadstool for all these years. I suddenly sort of wake up to Mark Gertler.
The young rebel sailed for London, assisted by a gift of £100 from his grandmother.
In those days in Sydney, unbelievably broke, you know, living in King's Cross, sharing one of those attics in Rockwell Crescent.
In 1934, Peter Finch and Donald were living in Sydney's bohemian area, King's Cross. Trader Faulkner's biography contains some of the few surviving photographs of Finch's early career.
Completely unpretentious person, Peter. He was really good right from the start, long before he went abroad and became famous. And he used to appear sometimes at the Maccabean Hall, you know, sort of gangsters' birthdays and things like that. And I'd be the stooge when he told a story, you know. I'd say, oh, you don't say that, and what happened then, you know? And, you know, he'd follow on the thing. And then he always used to do a bit of Shakespeare. And they knew he would. And they'd bought cabbages and stuff to chuck. And the stage would be littered with all of this, you see. And Peter didn't really mind, because these gangsters, you know. This, of course, the good old days, not the mafia, but the real gangsters, you know, the Razor gang and people like that. You see, they were operating in a different, rather decent sort of way then. They murdered one another, not the public, and they had consciences. And so if they threw cabbages at him, they felt that after they had to throw big tips. And, you know, there'd be fivers and this sort of thing. You could live for a couple of months on what was chucked at him. Marvellous bloke. It's a sort of reminiscence of those parts up there, really, you know, and general feeling, tropical fruit, flowers and all that. And these sort of windows I liked very much, you know. You get on the cane cutters' huts, there's sort of stick hanging, holding up the corrugated iron thing, you know. And you try to use the different things in the picture to sum up your actual personal life.
Tropical Australia, as irresistible as Africa, Ceylon, or Bali.
I thought it was wildly romantic, and palm trees and mangoes and things all over the place, you know. It was the height of the marvellous thing for me. And the Torres Strait Island natives whom I got to know in Cairns, in Malaytown, Cairns first, and then later went up and stayed on various occasions for months at a time up in the Torres Straits, going up to Thursday Island, from there up to Torres Straits by the crocus luggers. I'm mad about all that sort of thing, wonderful, you know. Their music, their language, dancing, they're really terrific people.
Lugger captain Charlie Sailor became a surrogate father to the young wayfarer, who was also accepted by Charlie's wife Uma and the islanders.
And the whole Sailor family, they were marvellous people. They and the Pitt family are all sort of intermarried, and cousins and so on. And they sort of more or less adopted me. The tropics from when I was a child was sort of romantic ideal, you know, and I didn't see them till I ran away from home when I was in my teens and went jumping a ratless and so on up to North Queensland. And I didn't mind being bashed up by the police and all the rest of it, you know, it's sort of part of Queensland life. You're just getting off a goods train and you think everything is all right, you know. And along comes some wretched policeman. You spend sometimes 3 or 4 days, sometimes a week in jail. You had to be careful where you got arrested, though, you know, because if you're too near a jail, you go to a jail, and that's very bad. You get a month at least there. Was lockup, a police lockup. It was sort of, in those days, I don't know what they're like now, but they're sort of friendly and casual, really, except you had to work a bit for the sergeant, you know. One was very young and desperately poor. One was beginning to be an artist. And the whole of these things were all coming together. And they still are in my mind, the idea of being young.